The text message that would shatter two worlds arrived at exactly 2:17 a.m., sliding into the wrong hands like a blade finding an unguarded throat. Zara Williams stared at her phone through exhaustion-blurred eyes, her nursing uniform still damp with antiseptic and the scent of industrial coffee clinging to her dark skin. The hospital floors had been brutal tonight. 3 emergency surgeries and a code blue that left her hands shaking and her mind scattered like broken glass. She needed those clinical notes. Tomorrow's exam would determine whether she stayed in the accelerated nursing program or joined the growing pile of dreams that couldn't survive student debt and 18-hour days. Her study partner Michelle had promised to send the cardiac assessment protocols, but Zara's phone showed nothing but silence and her own growing panic. Where are you watching from tonight? Maybe you're like Zara, burning the midnight oil in pursuit of something that matters more than sleep. Comment below and let me know what dreams keep you awake at 2 a.m. Her thumb moved across the cracked screen, typing with the desperate precision of someone who had learned that every minute mattered. Hey girl, I know it's late, but I'm dying here. Did you get the cardiac notes from Dr. Martinez? My phone died during rounds, and I missed everything about assessment protocols. Please tell me you have them. I'll owe you forever. The message disappeared into the digital void, carrying with it her hopes for tomorrow's exam. Zara set the phone aside and reached for her textbook, pages already worn soft from countless late-night study sessions. The words blurred together as exhaustion pulled at her consciousness like quicksand. 7 blocks away, in a boardroom where the air tasted of expensive cigars and carefully controlled violence, Jin Hyunwoo felt his phone vibrate against the Italian silk of his suit jacket. The sound was so soft it might have been a whisper, but in his world, even whispers could carry death sentences. He did not reach for the device. Not yet. The meeting had reached that delicate moment where breathing too loudly might shift the balance of power, where fortunes and lives hung suspended in the space between words. The 3 men seated across from him represented territory disputes that had already cost 6 lives this month. Jin's dark eyes remained fixed on their faces, reading the micro-expressions that revealed more than any contract ever could. The phone vibrated again, then again. Jin's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Only 5 people possessed his personal number. None of them would text repeatedly unless blood was being spilled. Mr. Park, the eldest of the 3 men, noticed the distraction first. His weathered face showed the kind of respect that came from understanding exactly how many ways Jin could end a life without disturbing the precise fold of his pocket square. Still, territory made men bold in foolish ways. The business can wait, Mr. Park said, his Korean formal and measured. Answer your phone, Hein Wussy. We understand the demands of your position. Jin's fingers moved with the fluid precision that had made him legendary in certain circles. The phone emerged from his jacket like a weapon being drawn, and his thumbs swept across the screen with surgical efficiency. What he found there made him pause in a way that violence never did. The message was all wrong. The tone, the language, the casual intimacy of someone who expected familiarity. No one spoke to Jin Hyunwoo about owing favors forever. No one called him girl. And absolutely no one mentioned Dr. Martinez and cardiac notes, as if he might have any understanding of such pedestrian concerns. A second message had followed. OMG, I'm so sorry. Wrong number. Please ignore that. I'm just a stressed nursing student who apparently can't even text the right person. Sorry again. The third message was even more intriguing. Although, if you do happen to have cardiac assessment protocols lying around, I'm still dying over here. Kidding. Sort of. Have a good night, mysterious stranger. Jin stared at the screen while the room around him held its collective breath. A nursing student. Someone young enough and innocent enough to joke with a stranger about being stressed. Someone who had somehow acquired his personal number. The one protected by layers of security that had cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. He should delete the messages. Block the number. Order his technology specialist to trace the breach and eliminate it with the thoroughness that had built his reputation. Instead, Jin found himself studying the words again, seeing something in their artless honesty that felt like sunlight in a world built entirely of shadows. Mr. Park cleared his throat, a sound that in other circumstances might have earned him consequences. Who dares to interrupt Jean Hyunwoo during business discussions? A mistake, Jean replied, his voice carrying the kind of calm that preceded storms. But an interesting one. The meeting resumed its careful dance of threats and territories, but Jin's attention had fractured. Part of him remained present, negotiating shipping routes and protection percentages with the same lethal precision that had elevated him above every rival who had ever tested his resolve. But another part, a part he had thought long dead, found itself thinking about a nursing student named Zara Williams who owed people favors forever and made jokes about cardiac protocols at 2 a.m. When the meeting finally concluded with handshakes that felt more like treaties than greetings, Gene waited until his boardroom emptied before lifting his phone again. The messages remained, their innocence almost surreal against the background of his evening's work. He should delete them. Instead, his fingers moved across the keyboard with the same precision he applied to everything else in his carefully controlled existence. "You seem distressed about your examination," he typed, each word chosen with the weight of someone who understood that language could be as dangerous as any blade. "Perhaps you should be more cautious about where you send such personal information." The reply came faster than he had expected. "Oh, my God, you actually answered. I'm so embarrassed. I swear I'm not usually this much of a disaster. My study partner gave me the wrong number, and I'm basically having a breakdown about tomorrow's test. Are you even awake this late, or are you going to wake up to this crazy person's messages?" Gene stared at the screen, something shifting in his chest that felt almost like amusement. She had no idea who she was talking to. No idea that her messages had interrupted negotiations worth more money than she would see in several lifetimes. No idea that the mysterious stranger she was apologizing to could buy and sell her entire university without affecting his monthly budget. Her transparency was fascinating in the way that exotic creatures were fascinating. Dangerous to observe too closely, but impossible to ignore. "I am awake," he replied. "Business keeps unusual hours." "What kind of business keeps you up at 2:30 a.m.? She responded immediately. "Are you a doctor too? A shift? Security guard? International spy? I'm going to keep guessing until you tell me or block me." Jin's mouth curved in what might have been a smile if anyone had been present to witness it. The idea of this Zara Williams guessing her way toward the truth was both amusing and impossible. If she knew what kind of business truly kept him awake, she would delete his number and pray they never cross paths in the physical world. "Something more complicated than medicine," he typed and left it at that. Her response made him pause again. "Mysterious and vague. You're either really boring or really interesting. Since you're up at 2:30 a.m. answering texts from random stressed-out nursing students, I'm going with interesting. Thanks for not immediately blocking me, by the way. This night has been terrible enough without adding terrified a stranger with my panic to the list." Gene found himself reading the message twice, then a third time. When had anyone last thanked him for not blocking them? When had anyone acknowledged his choice to engage as a kindness rather than an obligation? "You should be more careful with your communications," he wrote back, something in his chest tightening as he typed. Not everyone who receives misdirected messages would be so understanding. The response came quickly. "You're probably right. My mom always says I trust too easily. But honestly, you've been way nicer than my actual study partner, who still hasn't answered any of my texts. Maybe I should start texting wrong numbers more often. Trust too easily." The words echoed in Jin's mind as he set the phone aside and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a view of the city he controlled through careful violence and calculated intimidation. 23 floors below, the streets moved with the rhythm of a world that had no idea how much blood had been spilled to keep their small daily dramas running smoothly. Zara Williams trusted too easily. She made jokes with strangers and worried about examinations and worked hospital shifts that left her exhausted enough to text the wrong number. She inhabited a world so far from his own that they might as well have been living on different planets. which made it all the more intriguing that the universe had chosen to connect them through her careless fingers and his carefully guarded phone number. Jean retrieved the device and began typing commands that would trace the number back to its source. Not because he intended harm, but because in his world, information was survival and ignorance was death. Within minutes, his screen filled with details that transformed Zara Williams from a disembodied voice into a living person with an address, a school record, a work history, and a face. The photograph from her nursing school identification showed dark skin that seemed to glow with health, eyes that held both intelligence and warmth, and a smile that suggested she found genuine joy in a world that had given Jean every reason to trust nothing and no one. She lived in a neighborhood that his security team would classify as vulnerable. She worked night shifts at a diner to fund her education. She had no criminal record, no suspicious associations, no protection beyond whatever faith she placed in a universe that had already proven itself willing to send her messages to dangerous men at dangerous hours. Jean studied her face until it was memorized completely, then closed the file and returned to his communications. One final message waited from her, time-stamped just moments before. Thanks for listening to me ramble about cardiac protocols and wrong numbers. I should probably let you get back to your mysterious business. Whatever you do, I hope you stay safe out there. The world feels pretty scary at 2 a.m. sometimes. The world feels pretty scary at 2 a.m. sometimes. Jean read the words again, struck by how different her version of scary must be from his own. She worried about examinations and student debt. He worried about rivals who would kill him for showing weakness and business partners who would betray him for the right price. But she had wished him safety, this nursing student who knew nothing about him except that he was awake when he should not be. She had offered genuine care to a stranger who had interrupted her panic with formal responses and vague warnings. Jean pocketed the phone and walked toward his private elevator, already mentally calculating the fastest route to the diner where Zara Williams would be working her next shift. He told himself it was simple due diligence, the kind of intelligence gathering that had kept him alive through a dozen territory wars and twice as many betrayals. But as the elevator descended through the floors of his tower, carrying him toward street level and the world where nursing students worried about cardiac protocols, Jean knew he was lying to himself. Due diligence did not explain the way her messages had lodged in his mind like splinters. Due diligence did not account for the strange warmth that had spread through his chest when she thanked him for his understanding. Due diligence certainly did not explain why he wanted to see if her smile was as genuine in person as it appeared in the photograph, or whether she would still trust so easily if she knew exactly what kind of mysterious business kept him awake at 2:30 a.m. The elevator doors opened onto the garage where his car waited like a sleeping predator, black and anonymous, and fast enough to outrun most forms of trouble. Jean settled into the driver's seat and started the engine, his destination clear even if his motivations remained muddied by emotions he had thought himself incapable of feeling. Somewhere across the city, Zara Williams was probably still awake, still worrying about tomorrow's examination, still trusting that the universe would somehow arrange itself in her favor. She had no way of knowing that her misdirected message had just rearranged the priorities of the most dangerous man in the city, or that he was now driving through empty streets with her address programmed into his navigation system and her smile burned into his memory. The collision she had accidentally initiated with 3 carelessly typed messages was about to become inevitable, and neither of their worlds would ever be the same. The Silver Spoon Diner squatted on the corner of 5th and Morrison like a tired beacon in the pre-dawn darkness, its neon sign stuttering between pink and white in a rhythm that suggested imminent electrical failure. Jean Hyunwoo sat in his car across the street, studying the establishment through windows tinted dark enough to hide secrets and expensive enough to stop bullets. Inside the diner, visible through glass that had seen better decades, a young black woman moved between tables with the fluid efficiency of someone who had learned to maximize every motion. Even from this distance, Jean could see that this was Zara Williams, the nursing student whose misdirected messages had somehow breached every layer of security around his private communications. She was smaller than he had expected, more delicate, but there was nothing fragile about the way she carried herself. She navigated between demanding customers and stacks of dishes with a competence that spoke of hard-won experience, her uniform pristine despite the chaos of the dinner rush that had clearly stretched well past its intended end. Jean checked his watch. 3:15 in the morning. Most legitimate businesses had closed hours ago, but the Silver Spoon served the night shift workers, the insomniacs, the people whose lives ran on schedules that polite society preferred to ignore. It was exactly the kind of place where a nursing student might work to fund her education, and exactly the kind of place that his world rarely intersected with. He should leave. The smart thing, the safe thing, would be to return to his tower and pretend that misdirected messages were simply another hazard of modern technology. But Jean had not built his empire by always choosing the safe option, and something about Zara Williams had lodged in his mind like a splinter that demanded attention. Through the diner window, he watched her approach a table of construction workers whose loud voices and aggressive gestures suggested they had been drinking elsewhere before arriving here. She handled them with a combination of professional courtesy and subtle authority that impressed him despite himself. When one of them reached for her wrist as she collected their plates, she stepped back with practiced ease and said something that made them laugh instead of escalate. Intelligence, grace under pressure, the ability to defuse tension without creating confrontation. These were skills that Jean valued in his own organization, and seeing them deployed by a nursing student in a rundown diner only deepened the mystery of who Zara Williams really was. He exited his car with the controlled precision that had become second nature, every movement calculated to project exactly the right amount of presence. The neighborhood around the diner was the kind that noticed expensive suits and foreign luxury vehicles, the kind where his appearance would generate questions and rumors. But Jean had long ago learned to use his natural intimidation factor as both shield and weapon. The door chime announced his arrival with a sound that seemed to cut through the diner's ambient noise like a blade. Conversations quieted, heads turned, and Jean felt the familiar weight of attention settling on his shoulders. He was accustomed to commanding spaces through presence alone, but this felt different somehow. Here, among the tired shift workers and late-night wanderers, his power felt more pronounced, more alien. Zara appeared at his shoulder before he had fully crossed the threshold, her smile warm and professional despite the hour and the obvious exhaustion that shadowed her dark eyes. She carried the scent of coffee and industrial disinfectant, familiar smells that somehow seemed different when attached to someone he had been thinking about for the better part of an hour. "Just you tonight?" she asked, her voice carrying none of the wariness that his appearance usually inspired. There was genuine friendliness in her tone, the kind of automatic courtesy that suggested she treated every customer as if they might become a regular. Jean nodded, allowing her to lead him to a booth near the back of the restaurant. The vinyl seats had been repaired with duct tape that someone had at least attempted to match to the original color, and the table showed the accumulated wear of thousands of late-night conversations. It was so far removed from his usual environment that it felt almost surreal. As she handed him a laminated menu that had clearly seen better years, their fingers brushed for a fraction of a second. The contact was brief, innocent, meaningless, but Jean found himself noting the warmth of her skin and the way her hands showed the careful maintenance of someone who worked in medical settings. "Coffee to start?" she asked, already reaching for the pot that seemed to be a permanent extension of her right arm. "Please," Jean replied, his formal tone sounding strange even to his own ears in this casual environment. She poured with the practiced efficiency of someone who had performed this action thousands of times. But Jean noticed the way her movements had a natural grace that no amount of training could impart. When she looked up to meet his eyes, he saw intelligence there, curiosity, and something that might have been concern. "You look like you've had a long night," she observed, her comment walking the line between professional courtesy and genuine interest. "Business keeping you up?" The question was innocent enough, but it resonated with their text exchange in a way that made Jean wonder if she had made the connection. He studied her face for any sign of recognition, any indication that she had linked the mysterious stranger from her phone to the formal customer now sitting in her section. Something like that, he said, echoing his earlier response while watching carefully for her reaction. Zara's smile widened slightly, and Jean caught what might have been a flicker of amusement in her eyes. Well, whatever kind of business you're in, you dress better than most of our late-night crowd. Let me know when you're ready to order, and I'll try not to spill coffee on that suit. It looks expensive enough to fund my entire semester. She moved away to tend to other customers, leaving Jean alone with his coffee and his thoughts. The beverage was stronger than what he usually drank, more bitter, but there was something honest about its complete lack of pretension. Like everything else about this place, it made no attempt to be anything other than exactly what it was. Jean sipped the coffee and watched Zara work, noting the way she remembered orders without writing them down, how she anticipated customers' needs before they vocalized them, the manner in which she managed to maintain genuine warmth despite obvious fatigue. These were not skills that could be taught easily. They came from natural aptitude combined with experience, and seeing them in action only deepened his interest in who she was beneath the uniform and the professional smile. A new customer entered the diner, and Jin's attention shifted immediately to the man in the leather jacket whose movements carried a familiarity that triggered every instinct Jin had developed over years of survival. The newcomer's eyes swept the restaurant with the systematic thoroughness of someone conducting surveillance, and when that gaze settled on Jin's booth, recognition flashed across features that Jin had seen before in contexts that usually ended with bloodshed. Kim Jae-sung, foot soldier for the Gwangju crew, the rival organization that had been testing Jin's territorial boundaries for the past 3 months. The same organization that had necessitated tonight's late meeting about shipping routes and protection percentages. Jae-sung's presence here could not be coincidence. Jin continued drinking his coffee, maintaining the facade of a late-night customer while his mind calculated distances, exits, and the potential for collateral damage. The diner held perhaps 15 other people, all of whom would become casualties if this encounter escalated in the wrong direction, including Zara Williams, whose only crime had been texting the wrong number and serving coffee to a man whose enemies had apparently been watching his movements. Jae-sung approached with the casual confidence of someone who believed he held tactical advantage, sliding into the booth across from Jin without invitation. His smile carried the kind of oily politeness that preceded violence in their world. Jin Hyun-wusi, Jae-sung said, his Korean formal but tinged with disrespect that would have earned consequences in other circumstances. Interesting place for a man of your stature to take coffee. Very democratic of you. I have broad tastes, Jin replied, his voice carrying the kind of calm that had learned to precede storms. Jae-sung's eyes flicked toward Zura, who was refilling coffee cups at a table near the front windows. She had not yet noticed the new dynamic at Jin's booth, but her presence suddenly felt like a loaded weapon that either man might accidentally discharge. Pretty girl, Jae-sung observed, his tone making the comment feel like a threat. Seems friendly. The kind who trusts easily, perhaps. Would be unfortunate if something happened to disrupt her quiet life. The words hit Jin with the force of recognition. Zara had used almost identical phrasing in her text messages, describing herself as someone who trusted too easily, which meant that Jae-sung's presence here was not about territorial disputes or shipping routes. It was about the messages she had sent, the security breach that had somehow been detected and traced back to its source. Jin's hand moved to rest casually on the table, but his fingers were positioned exactly where they could reach the blade hidden in his jacket cuff. The movement was subtle enough to appear relaxed while being obvious enough to communicate intent to someone who understood such languages. She appears to be under no immediate threat, Jin said, each word measured and weighted. I would prefer that situation to remain unchanged. Jae-sung's smile widened, but the expression never reached his eyes. Of course, but accidents happen so easily in this part of town. Robbery attempts, random violence, the kinds of tragedies that could befall anyone unlucky enough to attract the wrong kind of attention. The threat was clear, direct, and completely unacceptable. Gene had built his reputation on protecting what belonged to him with absolute ruthlessness, and somehow, without his permission or understanding, Zara Williams had been placed in that category. The realization should have surprised him. Instead, it felt like acknowledgement of something that had been building since her first misdirected message. That would be inadvisable, Gene said, his voice dropping to the register that had preceded the last words many men had ever heard. Jae-sung leaned back in his seat, apparently satisfied that his message had been delivered and received. Your concern is noted, Hyen Wussy. Perhaps you should consider more carefully who receives access to your private communications. Information security has become such a complicated matter in the modern age. He stood and walked toward the exit, pausing only to nod politely at Zara as she approached their table with the coffee pot. She smiled and returned the greeting with the same automatic courtesy she showed every customer, having no idea that she had just been threatened by a man who killed for territory disputes and profit margins. Everything okay? She asked Gene, apparently noting some change in his demeanor. Your friend seemed to leave in a hurry. Business associate, Gene corrected, the distinction important in ways she could not understand. And yes, everything is acceptable for the moment. But it was not acceptable, and they both knew it. Jae-sung's visit had transformed Zara Williams from an interesting mystery into an immediate responsibility. By texting Jin's private number, by engaging him in conversation that had been monitored and traced, she had unknowingly stepped into a world where people died for smaller transgressions than compromising security protocols. Gene finished his coffee and placed enough cash on the table to cover the bill twice over. When Zara approached to collect the payment, he stood and captured her attention with the kind of direct eye contact that had been known to make hardened criminals confess their sins. Miss Williams, he said, using her name for the first time and watching recognition bloom across her features. I believe we need to discuss your text messages from earlier this evening. Her eyes widened as the pieces connected, surprise and embarrassment warring across her expression. Oh my God! You're the mystery business person. I can't believe you actually came here. I'm so sorry about those messages. I was completely freaked out about my exam, and I wasn't thinking straight, and I never meant to bother you with my drama. Gene raised a hand to stop the flow of apologies, his attention divided between her words and the continued surveillance he knew was occurring from outside the diner. Jae-sung would not have come alone, which meant they were being watched, evaluated, cataloged for future reference. The messages were not unwelcome, he said, the admission surprising them both. However, they have created complications that require immediate attention. You're no longer safe working here. Zara blinked, confusion replacing embarrassment. I'm sorry, what? Safe? What are you talking about? Gene glanced toward the windows, where shadows moved with purpose that had nothing to do with late-night foot traffic. The watchers were positioning themselves, which meant time was becoming a factor in ways that would soon require decisive action. Someone follow me here tonight, he explained, his voice carrying the kind of urgent calm that demanded attention without inspiring panic. Someone who views your contact with me as a security threat. Your presence here has become a liability that puts you in immediate danger. The explanation was necessarily vague, but Zara was intelligent enough to read between the lines. Her face went through several expressions in rapid succession, settling finally on a combination of disbelief and growing alarm. Are you saying that texting the wrong number has somehow put me in actual danger? She asked, her voice dropping to match his conspiratorial tone. What kind of business are you in? The kind that does not forgive mistakes easily, Gene replied, reaching into his jacket to retrieve a business card that contained nothing but a phone number. You need to leave with me now, tonight, before the people watching us decide that eliminating you is simpler than managing the complications you represent. Zara stared at the card as if it might explode, her mind clearly trying to process information that had no place in her previous understanding of the world. Gene could see the moment when the reality of her situation began to sink in, when the academic knowledge of dangerous people became personal experience. I can't just leave, she said, but her voice lacked conviction. I have a job, school, responsibilities. I can't disappear because some random stranger claims I'm in danger from people I've never met. Jean looked toward the kitchen, where a manager was visible through the service window, then back at her face with its expression of growing panic. The choice was no longer theoretical. She could come with him voluntarily, or she could remain here and discover firsthand how seriously his enemies took security breaches. Miss Williams, he said, his formal tone carrying absolute certainty. You sent 3 text messages to a number that 5 people in this city are authorized to contact. Those messages have been traced, analyzed, and deemed a potential threat by individuals who do not distinguish between intentional and accidental breaches of protocol. Your safety now depends entirely on accepting my protection. The words hung between them like a bridge across an abyss, offering passage to a destination she could not see and promising safety from dangers she could not yet comprehend. Jean watched her face as she processed the impossible choice he was presenting, knowing that her answer would determine not just her immediate future, but the trajectory of both their lives. Outside, the shadows continued their patient surveillance, waiting for the moment when conversation would give way to action and the nursing student who had texted the wrong number would discover exactly what kind of business kept mysterious strangers awake at 2:30 in the morning. The penthouse that Jean Hyunwoo called home occupied the top 3 floors of a building that seemed to scrape the belly of heaven itself, its windows offering views that transformed the city into a glittering circuit board of lights and shadows. Zara Williams stood in the center of what he had called the guest suite, surrounded by more luxury than she had encountered in all her 24 years combined, and fought the urge to touch everything just to confirm it was real. The room was larger than her entire apartment, decorated in shades of cream and gold that seemed to glow in the soft lighting that had automatically adjusted itself when she entered. The bed could have housed a small family, its linens so perfectly pressed they looked like they had never been disturbed by anything as mundane as human sleep. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed a world spread out below, like a kingdom waiting to be claimed. But it was still a cage, no matter how beautiful the bars. Jean had disappeared 20 minutes ago after showing her to this space, promising explanations and clean clothes and answers to questions she was still formulating. His absence gave her time to process what had happened, time to understand that her life had been fundamentally altered by 3 text messages and a late-night encounter with a man whose enemies considered her existence a problem requiring permanent solutions. She pulled her phone from her uniform pocket, her thumb hovering over her contacts list. She should call someone. Michelle, to explain why she would not be at tomorrow's exam. Her manager at the diner, to explain why she would not be finishing her shift or showing up for future ones. Her mother, to explain that her daughter had somehow stumbled into a situation that sounded like the plot of a movie she would never watch. But what explanation could she offer that would not sound like elaborate fiction or evidence of a complete mental breakdown? The truth was impossible. The lie was even worse. The sound of footsteps in the hallway outside made her pocket the phone quickly, though she could not explain why the action felt secretive. When Jean appeared in the doorway, he had changed from his formal suit into dark jeans and a black sweater that somehow made him seem both more approachable and more dangerous. The casual clothes revealed the precise lines of his shoulders and the controlled power in his movements that expensive tailoring had previously disguised. He carried a tray that held food she had not asked for and tea that smelled like jasmine and distant mountains. The gesture was unexpectedly thoughtful, almost domestic, and it made her feel off balance in ways that had nothing to do with her current circumstances. You should eat, he said, setting the tray on a table that probably cost more than her semester tuition. The past few hours have been demanding, and you will need your strength for the conversations we must have. Zara looked at the food, beautifully prepared and artfully arranged, then back at Jin's face with its expression of controlled concern. I need to call my school, she said, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. And my job. People will be expecting me, and when I don't show up, they're going to ask questions. Jean nodded, as if he had been anticipating this request. That has been arranged. Your manager received a call explaining that you have experienced a family emergency requiring immediate travel. Your school has been informed that you're taking a temporary medical leave due to stress-related complications. The casual efficiency with which he had dismantled her normal life should have terrified her. Instead, Zara found herself impressed despite her circumstances. He had thought ahead, planned for her concerns, handled details that she had not even considered yet. But the control he was exercising over her situation was absolute, and that realization sent a chill down her spine that had nothing to do with the climate-controlled air. "You can't just make decisions about my life without consulting me," she said, her voice carrying the kind of firmness that came from years of dealing with difficult patients and demanding professors. "I appreciate that you're trying to protect me, but I'm not your property. I have responsibilities, commitments, a life that doesn't just stop because you say it should." Jean paused in the act of pouring tea, his dark eyes settling on her face with an intensity that made her acutely aware of how small the room had become despite its generous dimensions. When he spoke, his voice carried the kind of measured calm that suggested he was accustomed to having his decisions questioned precisely never. "Your life stopped the moment Jae-sung walked into that diner," he said, each word delivered with surgical precision. "The moment he identified you as someone with access to my private communications. The moment he decided that your existence represented a threat to be eliminated rather than a problem to be managed. Your responsibilities and commitments are now secondary to your continued breathing." The words hit her like cold water, forcing her to confront the reality she had been trying to avoid. She was not here by choice, not really. She was here because the alternative was death at the hands of people she had never met for crimes she had never intended to commit. But accepting that reality did not mean surrendering her agency entirely. "I understand that I'm in danger," she said, moving to the window and looking out at the city that suddenly seemed much more hostile than it had 12 hours ago. "And I'm grateful that you're willing to protect me, even though I still don't understand why. But I need ground rules. Boundaries. I'm not going to be your prisoner, even if the cell is furnished with Egyptian cotton and room service." Jean finished pouring the tea and approached her position by the window, stopping close enough that she could detect the subtle scent of sandalwood and something else that might have been bergamot. His presence was warm and solid in a way that made her want to step closer, even as her mind insisted she should maintain distance. "What boundaries would you require?" he asked, and the question surprised her with its genuine consideration. Zara turned to face him, studying his expression for any sign that this was a test or a trap. What she saw instead was curiosity, as if her insistence on maintaining autonomy was a puzzle he found genuinely interesting rather than merely irritating. "I need to be able to contact my family," she said, ticking off requirements on her fingers. "My mother worries if she doesn't hear from me regularly, and disappearing completely will cause problems that go beyond just my immediate safety. I need access to my schoolwork. If I'm taking a medical leave, I can still study independently so I don't fall behind. And I need to understand what's happening and why, not just be told that I should accept protection without explanation." Jean listened to her requirements with a kind of focused attention that suggested he was memorizing each detail for future reference. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, apparently considering the implications of her requests. "Communication with your family can be arranged through secure channels," he said finally. "Educational materials can be acquired through methods that will not reveal your current location. As for explanations, that conversation will require more time and more trust than we have established at this point." It was a negotiation, Zara realized. Not the complete capitulation she had feared, but also not the total freedom she had hoped for. It was compromise, the kind of careful balance between competing needs that suggested he respected her intelligence, even if he could not afford to respect her independence completely. She looked around the room again, seeing it now not as a prison, but as a temporary sanctuary. The luxury was still overwhelming, still completely outside her previous experience, but no longer felt like decoration on a cage. It felt like protection that happened to be beautiful. "How long?" she asked, the question encompassing everything she could not yet articulate about time and safety and the life she had left behind. Jean moved to stand beside her at the window, his shoulder brushing hers in a contact that felt both accidental and inevitable. Together, they looked out at the city where her normal life continued without her, where people went to classes and jobs and late-night diners without understanding how quickly everything familiar could disappear. Until the threat is neutralized, he said, his voice carrying a certainty that was both comforting and ominous. Until the people who view your existence as problematic understand that harming you would be significantly more expensive than tolerating your continued presence in the world. The phrasing was clinical, almost businesslike, but Zara caught something underneath the formal language that sounded almost like possessiveness. As if somewhere in the space between her wrong number and this moment, she had become something he was determined to keep safe regardless of the cost. She should have been frightened by that realization. Instead, she found it oddly reassuring. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the city lights flicker like stars that had fallen to earth and decided to stay. The tea grew cold on its tray. The food remained untouched, and the boundaries they had negotiated hung between them like a bridge that neither was quite ready to cross. When Jean finally spoke again, his voice had lost some of its formal edge, becoming something closer to the mysterious stranger who had answered her frantic text messages with unexpected patience. "You should rest," he said, but he made no immediate move to leave her alone with the luxury and the questions that would keep her awake despite the late hour. Zara turned to study his profile, noting the way the city lights cast shadows across features that seemed carved from something harder than mere flesh. There was loneliness there, she thought, hidden beneath layers of control and carefully maintained distance. The kind of isolation that came from living in a world where trust was a luxury no one could afford. "Jean," she said, using his name for the first time since learning it, and watching the way something in his posture shifted when she did. He turned to look at her, and for a moment the careful mask he wore slipped just enough to reveal something almost vulnerable underneath. The moment lasted only seconds, but it was long enough for Zara to understand that the man who commanded empires and inspired fear and hardened criminals was also someone who answered text messages from stressed nursing students at 2:30 in the morning and worried about whether she had eaten enough to maintain her strength. "Thank you," she said simply, "for protecting me, for listening to my ridiculous requests, for not making this any more terrifying than it had to be." Jin's expression went through several changes before settling into something that might have been surprise. When had anyone last thanked him for being considerate rather than feared? When had anyone acknowledged his choices as kindness rather than strategy? "You are stronger than I anticipated," he admitted, the words seeming to surprise him as much as they surprised her. Most people would have collapsed under the weight of these circumstances. "You negotiate as if you believe you have power in this situation." "I do have power," Zara replied, understanding something fundamental about their dynamic that he had not yet recognized. "You need me to trust you, which means my cooperation is valuable. You need me to stay alive, which means my well-being matters. You need me to not become a larger problem than I already am, which means keeping me relatively content serves your interests." That's not nothing. Jean stared at her as if she had just revealed the solution to a puzzle he had been trying to solve since the moment he received her first text message. The nursing student who trusted too easily had just demonstrated that her trust came with intelligence attached, that her willingness to accept his protection was based on calculation rather than helplessness. The realization changed something fundamental in the way he looked at her, and Zara could see the exact moment when his assessment of her shifted from protected asset to respected adversary. "Perhaps," he said slowly, "this arrangement will prove more interesting than either of us anticipated." The words carried implications that made the air between them feel charged with possibility, as if the boundaries they had negotiated were already insufficient to contain whatever was building in the space where their worlds had collided. Outside, the city continued its restless movement, unaware that somewhere in a penthouse that scraped the sky, A nursing student and a crime boss were discovering that protection could feel remarkably similar to something else entirely, something that neither of them had planned for and neither was quite prepared to name.